Hey everybody, welcome to Starting Line Church. My name is Al and I am one of the pastors here, and we're just really glad that you've joined us as we are in week 1 of our new series. Have you ever had a moment where you've needed God to intervene? A but God moment. What I mean by that is when you have a moment where things aren't going well, and all hope seems lost, but God steps in and does something. These are moments when life was this, but then God does this. Things were going this way, but then God said this. Things were falling apart, but then God gave me this. Have you ever been there? The Bible is filled with so many stories like this. When situations were going one way, but God does something so miraculous and so drastic that it goes a completely different way. This week, we're starting a brand new series called But God. And in this series, we're going to walk through different Bible stories each week to learn about God's character and God's heart and how He takes situations and turns them around. So our prayer during this series is that when we're in seasons where everything feels like it's falling apart or everything feels like it's against us, we would remember that there is a God who is for us. Today we get to dive into a story all the way back in the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. And to start off this series, we're going to journey through the life of a man named Joseph. We meet Joseph in the book of Genesis, and we learn that he and his family live in the land of Canaan. Jacob, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, is Joseph's father, and Joseph is working as a shepherd in his father's fields. We also learn that Joseph is one of 13 children. Joseph has 11 brothers and 1 sister. That poor girl. Now, with a family that large and that big, I'm sure you can imagine the sibling drama and dynamics and arguments that probably arose and took place on a regular basis. When I think back to growing up, one of the biggest dilemmas that my sister and I faced was who's going to get more of whatever we were eating. Right? If you have a sibling, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Mom says to pass out dessert, and you wanted to make sure you could do it so you could make sure your slice was the biggest one. You brought out the measuring stick, you brought out the magnifying glass to make sure that you got the one that had more. When you went through the drive-thru, you might want to be the one to check the bag so you could see which fries had the most in it, and you would give your sibling the other one. Right? I'm on to you. I did this. We all get this. There were so many sibling dynamics and problems between Joseph and his brothers, but it was a little more intense than who got more food. We first meet Joseph as a teenager working as a shepherd, tending his father's flocks of sheep with his other brothers. And over time, different things started happening that Joseph's brothers felt like their father Jacob was showing favoritism towards Joseph. So then we get frustrated, and this created a lot of animosity. Some of those things were Joseph's father had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. Then Joseph had this gift of interpreting dreams, so he would tell his brothers about the dreams that he was having, and they didn't like it because they kind of assumed that he thought that he was better than them because of it and because of the things that he was dreaming about. And along with that, there were moments where Joseph had to share with his father all the bad things that his brothers were doing in the fields when they were working. And so because of all of this, Joseph's brothers, they start to hate him very deeply. So much so that they take matters into their own hands and conspired against him. They conspired to get rid of him. So we're going to pick up reading in Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 23. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Then, just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain by killing our brother? We have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to the Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when they came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. So Joseph was so despised by his brothers that they sold him to the slave traders for 20 pieces of silver. His family actually sold him into slavery in Egypt. And then in the meantime, after we read this after, that they convince Jacob, their father, that Joseph was killed by wild animals. So he has no idea what's going on. Like, what's taking place is just horrific, right? It's terrible. Joseph is taken then to Egypt and is purchased by a man named Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. He was the captain in the guard for Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt. And over time, Potiphar, he started to see that and realize that there was something different about Joseph. And that something different, we know, is that he worshiped the Lord. He worshiped the one true God, not the gods that Egypt worshipped. And because, though, of what Potiphar saw in him, he was drawn to it because it seemed, and he saw that God was with Joseph. He was helping him and he was guiding him. So because of this, he puts Joseph in charge of the household and all of his property. He was promoted to the next level. All of the household and affairs ran smoothly. The crops and his livestock flourished. Joseph was given administrative responsibility over everything that Potiphar owned. What seemed to be bad was turning good. All these good things were happening, but then something happened. We learn that Potiphar's wife was attracted to Joseph and wanted to be with him, and she would approach him on a regular basis and put pressure on him to be with her. But Joseph, in his integrity and his commitment to God, he refused these wishes, and what he would do is that he would do everything he could to try to stay away from her. Well, this woman was very upset and very mad that Joseph was ignoring her. So one day she lied to Potiphar, her husband, and turned it all on Joseph, saying that he was trying to take advantage of her. And so time after time, Joseph just keeps trying to do the right thing, but he keeps facing all this injustice. And we continue the story. We read in Genesis 39, after this happens with Potiphar's wife, this is what happens. It says, Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. So not only was he in Potiphar's house unwillingly because of what his brothers did to him, now he's facing punishment for something he didn't even do. But when he's in prison, right, we just read, we see that just like Potiphar did, the prison guard learned to love Joseph. And he saw something different in him. And so he gave him responsibility in the prison. And when he's there, we read later in the story, Joseph, he starts interpreting dreams like he did for his brothers. And while he's doing this, Pharaoh finds out about it, that and Pharaoh's having all these crazy dreams. He calls upon Joseph to tell him what's going on and to interpret them. Well, Joseph starts doing this, and Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So he calls Joseph out of prison and puts him in charge of Egypt. And so Joseph actually becomes a ruler of the entire land of Egypt and helps them get through this terrible famine that lasts over the years. Like, this is crazy. Through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from shepherd to slave to convict to ruler. Like, this is insane. Because of the famine, people were coming to Egypt from all over the place to buy grain because that's where it was available. So Jacob, Joseph's father, hears that grain's available. So he tells his sons to go to Egypt and go purchase it. But Joseph is now the governor of all of Egypt and in charge of selling the grain. So it was him that his brothers came to. Kind of full circle, right? Kind of weird. And what's crazy is that his brothers went to Egypt multiple different times, and each time they didn't even recognize Joseph. Didn't even recognize him. They sold him into slavery. Like, how would they think that this was him, right? We learn that he eventually told them who he was. And then after that, Jacob, Joseph's father, dies. And it's in this season where they find out who he is and Jacob dies, that all this is going on. It's this realization to his brothers that Jacob is gone. And Joseph now has authority in Egypt. And his brothers start freaking out. Like, they start panicking. They start thinking, oh no, like, what is he going to do to us because of what we did to him? Decades later, the roles are reversed for Joseph and his brothers. He was the strong one. They were the weak ones. He was the one in authority. They were the vulnerable. And they came to him fearing that what he was going to do to get even with them and to harm them because of all the evil and the horrific things they did to him. And they come to him and they say like all these things like, please spare us. But Joseph, he doesn't get even. And his answer to why is inspiring. We read it in Genesis 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew word here for intended or meant is to devise a plan. It's to calculate, invent, or impute. So in other words, in the context of this verse that we just read, you intended to harm me. You calculated evil against me. You tried to impute danger upon me, but God used it for my good. See, the harm was great, but God is greater. The harm was great, but God is greater. What I mean by great here is a lot. There was a lot of harm. There was a great deal of harm in this story. Joseph was betrayed and abandoned by his family. He was exposed to sexual temptation and punished after doing the right thing. He endured long imprisonment. He was forgotten by those he helped. And we can't forget that all this chaos started in the first place because his brothers sold him into slavery. There was so much evil that was going on. And Joseph, he isn't saying that the harm in and of itself was good. The tragedy and the pain that he had to endure was not good. Evil things are evil. Bad things are bad. That's true. And unfortunately how life is. We don't want to ignore that. But what Joseph is saying here in this moment is that what is good is the fact that God is bigger than any harm we face, than any tragedy we face, than any pain we face. It's not us learning to be okay with the bad, but learning that God is greater than any of it. By human standards, Joseph was justified to do whatever he wanted to his brothers, don't you think? Nobody would have thought he was crazy for getting back at them for all they had put him through. By human standards, he had every right to look at his situations and look at his circumstances and get angry and ask why and retaliate. But Joseph had a personal knowledge of God that molded his self-assurance, that molded his self-confidence, that allowed him to see things differently. He prospered where most would have failed. He flourished in the midst of tragedy. And even when everything was going wrong, he still continued to look to God, to respond positively to the situation. And when the harm was great and abundant and never ending, he shows us that God shows us that he's greater. Joseph realized that what others meant for evil, God used for good. Joseph's life looked like it was over when he was sold into slavery. When tragedy was striking, it seemed all hope seemed lost. But then he had this but God moment and witnessed that God is in the business of making all things new. He's in the business of turning tragedy to triumph. He's in the business of turning brokenness to blessing and turning evil for good. What was meant for evil, God uses for good. Have you ever had a moment like this, where good came out of tragedy? Have you had something really bad happen and you never even thought of it this way? You need Joseph's perspective here, that what is meant for evil, God uses for good. When negative situations, big or small, what are they in your life? What is God using in your life to bring good? Through Joseph, we learn that suffering, no matter how unfair, painful, unjust, can actually develop our faith. There's something that God teaches us and uses and speaks to us and that we can learn from. It doesn't mean what's going on is fun or right or fair or just or doesn't have ramifications in our lives. Tragedy causes pain. That's just reality. But we can acknowledge that God still shows up in the midst of tragedy and turns things around for good. In Romans 8:28, Paul writes this, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and who are called according to his purpose." My prayer for us today is that when these moments hit us in life, that we can lean in and see that God is greater and that he can use what was meant for evil for good. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you that in moments that seem suffocating and confusing, that you intervene and you step in and you show us that you have a different way. God, we thank you for your victory over evil and sin and death, that you have victory over it. So what is meant for evil, you can turn for good. That's a promise that we have. That's hope that we have. So God, let us lean into that in our life, in this season that we're in. Allow us to ask ourselves the question, God, what are you using for my good, and how can I learn from it? How can I grow in it? Jesus, allow us to have the perspective of Joseph here. We love you, and it's in your name that we pray. Amen. Well, thanks for joining us here in our first week of our But God series. I'm really excited to dive in just to all these different stories that we get to learn from and see how God intervenes in the midst of them. One last thing before we go, one of the ways that we worship here is through the act of giving. If you want to give financially to Starting Line Church, just as an act of really symbolism of acting and giving how God has given to us. We're giving back to how he has blessed us. And so if you want to do that, you can do that online, in the mail, at the hub, in our in-person gatherings, if you feel called to do that. But otherwise, we will see you next week for week 2 of our series. We'll see you then.